The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind is Tathagata. Today is day 3 of this 7-day sesshin here at Hidden Valley Zen Center in July 2019. And we will continue with some more of Hakuin's teachings. Hakuin Ekaku was quite the storyteller. And today I'll share one of his teaching stories with you. I think I'll read through the whole story first and then speak to the import of it for us. So again, it's coming out of this amazing thick volume, The Complete Poison Blossoms in a Thicket of Thorns, which was translated by Norman Waddell and is well worth the pricey price tag if you have any interest in learning or comprehending or being inspired by Hakuin's teachings. There are other translations as well, also done by Norman Waddell, so you don't have to shell out $50-some if you don't want it right away. One of the nicest ones, most inspiring ones, and most easy to relate to ones, I think, is Wild Ivy, which is the story of his life. It's his autobiography. And if you find Hakuin inspiring, then I would also suggest that you get hold of some of the writings of Torei Inji, who was Hakuin's, I think it was his first Dharma successor, but certainly he was his most major Dharma successor. And in fact, he had hoped to have Torei take over Shoinji, his temple, but Torei wanted to continue his practice, continue his deepening, which also has its merits. So, without further ado, let me get to this story. There once was a priest proficient in both practice and wisdom, who resolved to seek out a peaceful sanctuary where he could engage in a retreat. After considerable effort, he located a cave deep in the mountains. He was extremely happy with the site. There was a large flat rock in front of it and a great tree towering above it. He did zazen all day long on the flat rock, but when night came, a flock of herons, several hundred strong, flew in and perched in the tree overhead. Have you ever heard a heron's cry? It's not what we would call bird song. They squawked and squabbled all through the night. The priest looked up, performed gasho, and addressed them in a loud voice. There are many large trees in the world. With your wings, you herons could fly and perch in any one of them. It took me a long time and much arduous travel to find this quiet spot where I could meditate. Leave that tree and allow me to do my zazen in peace. You make so much noise, it's impossible for me to concentrate on my practice. At first light, the herons flew off again, but at dusk they returned and assumed their perches in the tree. Angered, the priest was unable to get any sleep that night, and as the herons flew off the next morning, he glared up at them and yelled at the top of his lungs, "Why do you insist on flying into that tree and disturbing my meditation? If you keep coming here, I'll have to leave this cave and find another one someplace else. But if I end up wandering aimlessly around the country and I'm unable to complete my practice, I promise you that I will be reborn as a great and powerful hawk, and I'll snatch you and rip you to pieces and devour you all." He's kind of furious. When night came, the herons returned once again, and with tears in his eyes, the priest set out for other parts. After much travel, he came to a cave among the cliffs, and it overlooked a deep lake 10,000 yards across. It was large enough for him to use as his living quarters, a spot of great beauty and tranquility, totally cut off from the world. The priest was elated and unpacked his travel pouch to stay. He spent the entire day sitting upright in Zazen, immersed in the profound realm of no mind. Unfortunately, the lake was inhabited by a great many fish and turtles, and their sporting and splashing through the waves day and night made a considerable noise. This troubled the priest, angering him as much as the squawking herons had. When the fish and turtles also ignored all his pleas and attempts to reason with him, he went to the lakeside and hollered out, "You are obstructing my zazen. What did I ever do to you to deserve this? I'm going to leave this cave, but if I fail to attain the way, I'm going to be reborn as an otter, and I'm going to tear all of you to shreds and eat you." The priest left the cave in tears the next morning, and as he walked along, however, he was no longer able to endure the resentment burning inside him. "I'll find similar obstacles wherever I go." And this is something to consider. I'll find similar obstacles wherever I go. I'll never be able to free myself of the anger I feel. I'll be better off ending my life right here so I won't have to endure it any longer. In this fit of rage, he threw himself into the lake and sank beneath the waves. He was soon reborn as an otter and began sporting freely through the water. He turned and twisted 100 different ways, catching the denizens of the lake one by one. He ripped off their heads, he crushed them in his teeth until the lake was crimson with their blood. Exhausted, the otter fell back in a daze. And just then, a noisy flock of squawking herons flew overhead. Taking one look at them, the otter's eyes filled with hate. Gnashing his teeth, he yelled up at the birds, "I've been waiting for you. I made a promise on that flat rock under the tree. I've been waiting for a chance to carry it out ever since I became an otter. Not a single bird is going to leave here alive." And 2 great hawk wings suddenly sprouted from his sides, and he rose out of the lake and began flapping his way through the sky. He moved like a lightning bolt, seizing the herons in midair, ripping them apart and devouring them. Heron wings and feathers wafted on the wind like willow fluff. Gore fell like crimson rain from the sky. Once again, the clear, pure waters of the bottomless lake were red with blood. How many lives had he taken? He belonged to the fraternity of Buddhist priests, but because he never learned about the practice that must continue after Kensho, he ended up inflicting these terrible calamities. He is truly to be pitied. And that's the message that Hakuin was trying to relate to us. That's one of the messages. That if we stop short of full awakening, if we find ourselves content with a single minor Kensho, or with no Kensho at all, we will not have taken advantage of this incredible life we have. That he was bothered by the herons in the tree says somehow his depth of practice was not deep enough. It's not that he would go into some no person's land and zone out. It's that he would be so present with all the squawking and squealing and rustling and flapping of wings that there would be no problem. He wouldn't need to have a quiet place in order to do his practice. If we need a quiet place in order to do our practice is not sufficient. This is why Hakuin said so many times that practice in the midst of activity is so much more potent and so much more worth it than practice in a quiet place. course, when we're starting out, and even at other times as well, to have a quiet place to practice can be helpful. But if we need to have a quiet place in order to practice, then we've got the wrong idea about Zazen. And if we have to zone out and dissociate in order to feel like we're practicing, that again is a mistake. In the midst of activity, this is where the deepest practice can take place. And not only the deepest practice, but the most effective practice. We do, as I said, need to have time in the Zendo, or the equivalent of the Zendo, to form a basis of our practice. But then it needs to be tested. Shoju Rojin, who was the priest who became Hakuin's real teacher and only teacher really, deeply, deeply realized person, used to go and do Zazen in the cemeteries, in the villages, to test the strength of his Zazen. At the time, the villages were overrun at night with packs of wolves. And supposedly they would even snatch children out of houses. And he was very aware of the hot breath of these animals as they sniffed at his ears and sniffed around his face. And he sat deep in Zazen, not trying to pretend they weren't there, not trying to find some pleasant place within himself that he could hide out in, but so fully present that there was no problem. This is what Jacques Lucéron did in Buchenwald as well. In the concentration camp, where people were being murdered day and night, officially murdered and unofficially murdered. They had so many different ways to do it that the inmates were in constant terror of dying. And some of the deaths were the result of the going berserk of the inmates themselves. And they would just lash out, strangle each other. And yet, in the middle of that, and in the middle of becoming so ill he was led away to die, Jacques Lucéron came to profound awakening. It's a most important admonition not to be caught in having to depend on an external environment in order to be happy, in order to do our practice, in order to live. Of course, sometimes there are choices available to us. And if we can live in a neighborhood where we don't have a bunch of yapping dogs all night long, that's great. But if we can't, then are we going to tear ourselves apart with fury because we can't sleep in the midst of it? Or are we going to somehow reach a point in letting go a felt need to have the environment fit what we think we need to have? In a certain way, that's the only freedom there is, to be able to let go a felt need to have the environment exactly the way we want it. And of course, that's a cause of suffering. One of the many ways we do suffer, by not being able to have things different from how they are. For having people around us that we don't want to have around us, to have people who we care about deeply and want to have around us leave. To have an environment that bugs us or is difficult to live in when there's no choice. That's a cause of suffering too, unless we can reach that place of incredible freedom that we have built in, and become free of that felt need. In order to have that happen, we need to dive deeply into our practice right in the midst of whatever is going on. If we try to shut ourselves into a quiet place, we're robbing ourselves of an opportunity to become free of a noisy place. And it's something we have to be careful about. Most people that come to do Zazen, that come to spiritual practice of any sort, come out of some level of discomfort. And they seek to relieve that discomfort through the spiritual practice. It can lead to what John Welwood, psychologist who's also a long-time Buddhist practitioner, calls doing an end run around your issues, or engaging in spiritual bypassing. That doesn't solve anything. It just reinforces the ways we deal with life to avoid. We don't seek out necessarily a noisy place, although if we really want to test our practice, we can. I think a little bit here of Sogenji. If you're not Japanese and you don't have a deep understanding of the Japanese culture, and certainly if you don't have the language, to go and find yourself in an icy zendo in the winter, one that is hot as blazes and full of humidity, 105 degrees easily, and 100% humidity in the summertime. Long hours of Zazen. Constant noise. Japan is a very noisy country, actually. And the Rochester Zen Center, it's located just one property away from East Avenue, which is a major thoroughfare in and out of the city. And there are constant sirens, both people being pulled over for speeding, but also there are any number of fire stations and at least 3 hospitals in close proximity. And on top of that, in the summer time, because the zendo is inside a home, what looks like a home on the outside, and still has the front door, which doesn't operate anymore because the altar is right behind it. People will come along with boom boxes or sometimes a guitar, sit on the porch and play music while you're in the midst of day 3 or day 4 or day 5 or day 6 or day 7 of a sesshin. And it's loud. And the zendo only has 2 windows and they're small. And they don't open all the way. And they don't use the air conditioning. Although just recently, I saw an announcement from Rochester saying they were finally going to use the air conditioning in the zendo after more than 50 years. One memorable sesshin, 4 people fainted before the end of the first night of the sesshin because of the heat. It's not so different in Japan at Sogenji. The hours are very long. There's not much chance for sleep. You usually have to make a decision either to brush your teeth or take a literally 5-minute and no longer than 5-minute nap. There aren't many breaks during the day, during sesshin, and they're very, very short. On the schedule, it looks like they're longer, but when you take into account that you have to go to and from the zendo as we do here. You come back from the dining hall to the zendo, which in the case of Sogenji, it's not as conveniently located as it is here in Hidden Valley Zen Center. And then there's some bows and a little bit more zazen, and then you're free to go to wherever you're staying, which again is another hike. And then again you have to be in the zendo, seated on your mat and cushion, doing zazen at least 10 minutes before the official start of the period. So there's precious little time in which to do anything. And then there are neighborhood dogs. In fact, they've made a great effort to capture and spay or neuter the what are now wild dogs on the mountain behind Sogenji that are constantly squabbling, tearing into each other. They are akitas, most of them, which are pretty aggressive animals. People like their little pussycats and their little kitties and their little puppy dogs, but when they grow into bigger animals, they're a little bit overwhelming, and they often will just set them free. And so there's a lot of noise, and then there's many other sources of noise. Sometimes people will come into the temple and poke their head into the zendo doorway and have to be told not to come in. But there's actually a wonderful practice in terms of the tenzo duties, the cook, the head cook duty. And here I'm talking really more about the head cook of the day. It's a different person normally each day during sesshin, and that person is responsible for preparing and serving the meals on time, and answering the doorbell, and answering the telephone, and greeting guests, and is also the first person into Sanzen in the morning, and the first person into Sanzen in the evening. So they have to keep their practice going at the same time. It's wonderful training for practice in the midst of activity. If we train like that and abandon our ideas of what we need to have in order to have, quote, good zazen or peaceful zazen, then it won't matter what circumstances our life brings us. We have the potential to become free in the middle of them, even if they're very difficult, even if they're terrible, like happened to Jacques Lutheran. So Hakuin tells the story of the priest who felt he needed to depend on a quiet place in order to do his practice, both to emphasize the need for post-satori practice and for continuing deepening after you've had a kensho, but also to point out that we have to be able to practice anywhere, under any circumstance. We have to be able to access that deep truth within us, that place of profound peace, compassion and wisdom within us, regardless of the exterior circumstances. Only then can we say that our practice is really maturing. This is why Hakuin's line is the only Rinzai line that is maintained since his time to the present time. It's because of the insistence on deep practice, expansive practice, practice in the midst of activity, true functioning practice. Thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.